The old farmhouse stood like a sentinel at the end of a winding dirt road, its weathered timber frame a testament to decades of harsh winters and scorching summers. Around it stretched acres of cornfields, golden under the late afternoon sun. To most people driving past, it looked like any other farm in this quiet corner of rural America. But the man who lived there was anything but ordinary. At 58, Thomas had the sun-weathered face of someone who'd spent most of his life outdoors. His calloused hands moved with purpose as he repaired the fence along his property line. Sweat dripped from his brow despite the cool autumn breeze. He'd been working since dawn, the way he did every day since purchasing this land 5 years ago. The farm had become his sanctuary after 22 years of military service. 4 tours as a Special Forces sniper had left him with skills few civilians possessed and memories few civilians could understand. Here, among his crops and the changing seasons, Thomas had finally found some measure of peace. He straightened up, pressing a hand against the small of his back as he surveyed his handiwork. The fence looked good, strong enough to keep the occasional deer from trampling his crops. As he gathered his tools, the distant rumble of engines caught his attention. Out here, visitors were rare. The nearest town was 12 miles away, and Thomas wasn't exactly the sociable type. The rumbling grew louder. Thomas shaded his eyes against the setting sun and spotted a cloud of dust rising from the road. His expression hardened. There was only one road leading to his property, and he wasn't expecting anyone. When the procession of motorcycles came into view, something cold settled in Thomas's stomach. 8 riders in leather jackets, their bikes gleaming in the sunlight. They slowed as they approached, finally coming to a stop in a loose semicircle at the edge of his property. Thomas set down his hammer and straightened to his full height. Years of farm work had kept him fit, but there was something else in his posture, a rigid alertness that never quite left him after his military years. "Can I help you?" he called out, voice carrying across the yard. His tone was neutral, but his eyes moved methodically from one rider to the next, assessing. The lead rider, a burly man with a thick beard and arms covered in tattoos, stepped off his bike. "Nice place you got here," he said, removing his sunglasses. "Mighty quiet." Thomas said nothing, just waited. The silence stretched uncomfortably. "Name's Ray," the biker finally offered. "These are my friends." He gestured to the others, who remained on their bikes, engines idling. "Thomas," came the simple reply. "You're a long way from the highway." Ray smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We're just passing through. Looking for a place to rest a while." His gaze drifted to the farmhouse. "Maybe get some water." Something about the way he looked at the house made Thomas's skin prickle. 22 years in combat zones had taught him to read people. These men hadn't stumbled across his farm by accident. "There's a gas station about 12 miles back toward town," Thomas said. "They've got water, food, whatever you need." Ray took a step forward, crossing the invisible boundary of Thomas's property. The other bikers remained where they were, but Thomas noted how they subtly repositioned themselves, spreading out. It was a movement he recognized, the kind predators make before surrounding prey. "Thing is," Ray said, "we've been riding all day. Looking to take a break somewhere peaceful." His eyes hardened slightly. "Somewhere like this." Thomas didn't move, didn't blink. His mind was already calculating distances, angles, threats. Old habits. "My farm isn't a rest stop," he said evenly. "And I value my privacy." Ray chuckled, looking back at his companions. "Hear that, boys? The man values his privacy." Several of the others laughed, the sound carrying ominously across the open field. Turning back to Thomas, Ray's voice dropped. "Here's the thing. We heard there's good hunting around these parts." He emphasized the word hunting strangely. "Thought we might stick around a few days. Thought your place might make a nice base camp." Thomas understood then. This wasn't a random encounter. Someone had sent them. Or they'd heard something about an isolated farmer with land worth taking. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to intimidate him. Back when he first bought the property, a local developer had sent men to convince him to sell. They'd left with a newfound respect for old farmers and their shotguns. But this felt different. These men had a feral confidence about them, the look of people accustomed to taking what they wanted without consequences. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Thomas said calmly. "This is private property. I'm not interested in hosting anyone. Now I'll ask you once to leave." Ray's smile vanished. He stepped closer, and Thomas could smell the leather of his jacket, the cigarettes on his breath. "You'll ask once?" Ray's voice was dangerously soft. "That sounds like there's an or else hanging in the air, old man. You threatening us?" The other bikers began to dismount now, engines cutting off one by one until only the chirping of crickets and the whisper of corn stalks in the breeze remained. Thomas didn't answer immediately. His eyes moved from man to man again, noting bulges in jackets that likely concealed weapons. 8 against 1. Not great odds. But he'd faced worse. "No threat," Thomas finally said. "Just a simple fact. This is my land. You're not welcome on it." Ray laughed, a harsh sound. "Well, ain't that something? The thing is, old-timer, you're outnumbered here. And we like this place. Good sight lines, remote. Perfect for our needs." "And what needs would those be?" Thomas asked, though he already suspected. "Let's just say we've got some business transactions planned, and your farm is ideally situated." Ray glanced around at the sprawling property. Plenty of space to store product away from prying eyes. Drug runners, Thomas realized. They were looking for a secluded location to store their supply before distribution. The isolation that had drawn Thomas to this property for peace was now making it a target. "The answer's still no," Thomas said firmly. Ray's expression darkened. "You're not hearing me. We're not asking permission." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a switchblade, flicking it open with practiced ease. "We're being courteous enough to give you a choice. You can stay and mind your business while we use a corner of your land, or you can leave. Either way, we're setting up shop here." The other bikers had formed a loose circle now. Thomas noted that 3 of them had their hands beneath their jackets. Armed, then. Just as he thought. "I've owned this land for 5 years, Thomas said quietly. "Worked it every day. Built something from nothing. I'm not going anywhere, and I'm not sharing it with drug dealers." Ray's eyes narrowed. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But guts won't stop a bullet." He gestured to one of his men. "Show the old man we're serious." A tall, lean biker with a shaved head stepped forward, pulling a handgun from his waistband. He pointed it casually in Thomas's direction. "Last chance," Ray said. "We move in, you stay out of our way, everybody lives." Thomas looked at the gun, then at Ray, and something shifted in his expression. The farm-worn weariness seemed to fall away, replaced by something harder, colder. His posture changed subtly, weight balanced perfectly, hands relaxed at his sides. There was nothing threatening in the way he stood, and yet something about him suddenly made Ray hesitate. 5 years ago, Thomas said, his voice so quiet the bikers had to strain to hear him, "I bought this land because I was tired of violence. Tired of death. I wanted peace." He looked around at the cornfields, golden in the setting sun. "And I found it here. For 5 years, I've lived without having to hurt anyone." His eyes, when they returned to Ray, were different, clear and focused in a way that made the biker leader take an involuntary step back. "Before that," Thomas continued, "I spent 22 years in special forces. 16 of those as a sniper with confirmed kills in distances you couldn't even see clearly. His voice remained conversational, but Ray suddenly felt cold despite the warm evening. I've eliminated targets in sandstorms, through jungle canopy, and in urban warfare with civilians present. I can hit a man-sized target at over a mile with the right conditions. The biker with the gun glanced uncertainly at Ray, who had gone very still. That's a nice story, old man, Ray said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. But talk is cheap. And we still have you outnumbered and outgunned. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. That's true. You do have numbers. But here's something for you to consider. He pointed to his farmhouse. In that house is my old kit. A Barrett M82 with custom modifications. From my second-floor window to where your bikes are parked is about 300 yards. At that distance, I could take out all 8 of you before any of you reached cover. The way he said it, matter of fact, without bravado, sent a chill through the group. It wasn't a threat. It was a professional assessment. You're bluffing, Ray said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. Thomas shrugged. Maybe. Ask yourselves if it's worth finding out. He looked each man in the eye, one by one. I came here for peace. I want to keep living peacefully. But make no mistake, if you force my hand, I will defend what's mine. A heavy silence fell over the yard. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the fields. In the distance, a hawk circled lazily, hunting for its evening meal. Finally, Ray repocketed his knife with a sharp click. Stand down, he muttered to the man with the gun, who hesitated before lowering the weapon. You've got a big mouth, old man, Ray said. Making claims about being some kind of military badass. Thomas said nothing, just waited. His stillness was unnerving. You know what? Ray finally said. This place isn't worth the trouble. Too remote for our needs anyway. He gestured to his men, who began moving back toward their bikes. But this isn't over. Nobody talks to me that way and just walks away. Thomas watched them mount their motorcycles. I hope it is over, he said. For everyone's sake. Ray's eyes blazed with humiliation and anger. We'll be seeing you again, farmer. Count on it. With a roar of engines, the bikers turned and sped away, dust billowing behind them. Thomas watched until they disappeared from view, then slowly exhaled. He knew they would be back. Men like that, with wounded pride and something to prove, always came back. And next time, they'd come better prepared, with more men, more weapons. Thomas looked toward his quiet farmhouse as darkness began to fall. 5 years of peace. He'd treasured every moment of it. Now he would have to prepare for war once again. Slowly, he gathered his tools and walked back to the house. There were preparations to make. And an old footlocker to open, one he'd hoped would remain closed forever. Night had fallen by the time Thomas reached the farmhouse. He moved through the darkness with practiced ease, his footsteps silent on the wooden porch. Inside, he lit a single lamp in the kitchen, casting long shadows across the worn floorboards. The house felt different now. For 5 years, it had been his sanctuary. Tonight, it felt like a fortress preparing for siege. Thomas made himself a simple dinner, bread, cheese, and cold meat from the refrigerator. He ate mechanically, his mind working through scenarios, contingencies, preparations. The military man he'd tried to leave behind was resurfacing with every passing minute. After washing his plate, Thomas climbed the narrow staircase to the second floor. At the end of the hallway stood a door he rarely opened. His bedroom was near the stairs, his office across from it. This door, the last one on the right, led to a room he'd hoped never to use again. The hinges creaked as he pushed it open. Moonlight spilled through the window, illuminating a sparse room. A desk, a chair, and in the corner, a heavy footlocker with a padlock. Thomas knelt before it, key in hand. For a moment, he hesitated. Opening this box meant crossing a line, acknowledging that peace was no longer an option. "They've already crossed that line," he murmured to himself, turning the key. The lock clicked open. Inside the footlocker lay the carefully preserved tools of his former profession. A disassembled Barrett M82, his long-range rifle from his final tour. His old service pistol. A ghillie suit, folded neatly. Various scopes, ammunition, and a maintenance kit. Thomas lifted the rifle components with reverent hands. 5 years of disuse, yet he'd maintained them meticulously. Some habits never died. He assembled the weapon with practiced movements, each piece fitting perfectly into place. When finished, he held a weapon capable of striking targets over a mile away. In his hands, it was deadly accurate. Thomas moved to the window and looked out across his property. The moonlight painted the cornfields silver. He studied the approach to the farm, the places someone might take cover, the angles and distances. The bikers would return. Men like Ray didn't back down when challenged. They escalated. Thomas placed the rifle on its stand near the window and returned to the footlocker. From a side compartment, he retrieved a small notebook, his old spotter's log from his military days. The back pages were blank. He began to draw a detailed map of his property, marking distances, sight lines, and potential defensive positions. By midnight, he had a comprehensive security plan. Thomas knew he should feel fear or anxiety facing 8 armed men alone. Instead, he felt a cold clarity he hadn't experienced in years. "First light," he muttered to himself, closing the notebook. "Start preparations at first light." As he prepared for bed, Thomas thought about the town sheriff, about calling for help. But the sheriff's office was understaffed and 20 minutes away at best. Out here, people handled their own problems. Thomas slept lightly that night, the old instincts keeping him half alert. Before dawn, he was already awake, watching the sun rise over his fields. The day had arrived to transform his peaceful farm into a defensive position. Thomas hoped the bikers would reconsider, that they'd recognize the risk wasn't worth it. But 22 years of military service had taught him to hope for the best while preparing for the worst. And so, as birds began their morning songs, Thomas Rose stepped out onto his porch to begin preparations for a battle he never wanted, but would not refuse. The morning sun climbed higher as Thomas worked methodically around his property. To any passing vehicle, he might have looked like a farmer tending to routine maintenance. But each task he completed served a dual purpose. He reinforced the gate at the entrance to his long driveway, adding a heavy chain and padlock. It wouldn't stop determined intruders, but it would slow them down and force them to make noise. Next, he strung nearly invisible fishing line at various heights across several approaches to the house, attaching small bells to some and empty cans to others. Simple tripwires that would give him advance warning. By midday, sweat soaked through his shirt as he dug small trenches at strategic points around the property. Into each, he placed glass bottles he'd been saving for recycling, covering them with a thin layer of dirt and straw. Anyone driving over them would get a flat tire. Improvise, adapt, overcome, he muttered to himself, an old military mantra that had served him well in combat zones around the world. After a quick lunch of cold sandwiches, Thomas turned his attention to the house itself. He moved furniture to create barricades near entryways. Heavy bookshelves, the old oak table from the dining room, anything that could provide cover. He mapped out sight lines from key windows, calculating angles and distances like he'd done thousands of times before. In the shed behind the house, Thomas found his old hunting spotlight. He mounted it on the corner of the roof, angled to illuminate the main approach. Next to it, he installed a motion sensor he'd once bought to detect deer in his garden. As afternoon faded toward evening, Thomas took his binoculars and climbed to the small attic. Through a vent in the gable, he had a commanding view of the surrounding countryside. The road leading to his farm stretched like a dusty ribbon through the fields. No movement. Not yet. His cell phone rang, startling him. Few people had his number. Hello? Thomas? It's Joe from the feed store. Your order of chicken feed came in early. Want me to hold it till next week? Thomas hesitated. Going into town meant leaving the farm undefended. But it also meant a chance to gather information. I'll come get it tomorrow morning, he decided. Thanks, Joe. After hanging up, Thomas returned to the second-floor room. The Barrett rested on its stand by the window, loaded but with the safety on. Beside it lay his service pistol, a Beretta M9 he'd carried for over a decade in the field. Thomas sat in the chair he'd positioned for optimal view of the approach road and checked his watch. Almost 6 in the evening now. If the bikers planned to return today, they'd likely come soon, using the setting sun to their advantage. He reached for the thermos of coffee he'd brought upstairs and poured a cup. The familiar routine, watching, waiting, staying alert, felt like slipping into old clothes that still fit perfectly. A distant memory surfaced, lying in a hide for 72 hours in Afghanistan, tracking a high-value target. His spotter had asked how he maintained focus for so long. You don't think about the waiting, Thomas had explained. You exist in each moment. Alert but patient. The target will come when it comes. Now, as shadows lengthened across his cornfields, Thomas settled into that same state of heightened awareness. The military had trained him to become invisible, to watch without being seen, to wait without growing restless. As darkness began to fall, no dust cloud appeared on the horizon. No rumble of motorcycles disturbed the evening quiet. But Thomas knew better than to relax his vigilance. The enemy rarely attacked when expected. Night fell over the farm, and still Thomas watched, a silent guardian protecting the peace he'd fought so hard to find. Dawn broke with no sign of the bikers. Thomas had dozed in short intervals throughout the night, an old skill from his combat days, sleeping just enough to function while remaining alert to danger. After a quick breakfast, he decided to make the trip into town. He needed supplies, and intelligence was always valuable. In his truck's glove compartment, he placed his Beretta, covered by an old road map. The drive to town took 15 minutes. Creston was small, one main street with essential businesses, a couple of side roads with modest homes. Thomas parked in front of Joe's feed store, scanning the street before getting out. Morning, Thomas, Joe called as the bell above the door announced his arrival. Early as usual. Morning, Joe, Thomas nodded, moving to the counter. Quiet day? So far. Joe wiped his hands on his apron. Your chicken feed's in the back. 50 pounds, right? Thomas nodded, then added casually, been seeing some unfamiliar folks around lately. Group of bikers passed by my place yesterday. Joe's expression changed slightly. Them. Yeah, they've been hanging around town the past couple days. Staying at the old motel on Route 16. Any trouble? Thomas asked, keeping his tone conversational. Not exactly trouble, but... Joe leaned forward, lowering his voice. Sheriff got a call from Bill at the gas station. Said they were asking about remote properties in the area. Specifically mentioned your place. Thomas's face revealed nothing, but his mind worked quickly. They mentioned me by name? Not your name. Asked about the old military guy with the big farm out east. Everyone knows that's you. This confirmed Thomas's suspicion, the visit hadn't been random. They'd been asking about him specifically. Any idea why they're interested? Thomas asked. Joe shrugged. Sheriff thinks they might be connected to those drug operations they've been finding in the county. looking for isolated places to set up shop. The sheriff know they came by my place? Don't think so, Joe replied. Want me to tell him? Thomas considered this. The local sheriff was a good man, but understaffed and overwhelmed by the county's growing drug problem. By the time help arrived, any confrontation would likely be over. No need, Thomas said finally. I can handle trespassers. Joe studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. I figured you'd say that. Your feed's loaded up already. On the house today. I appreciate it, but... No arguments, Joe interrupted. Consider it community support. We look out for each other here. Thomas thanked him and headed for the door. As he reached for the handle, Joe called out, Thomas? Be careful. Word is there's more than 8 of them altogether. The others came into town last night. This new information settled like a stone in Thomas's stomach. More than 8. The odds were worsening. In his truck, Thomas sat for a moment, recalculating. He'd prepared for 8 hostiles. Now the number was unknown, but definitely higher. He needed to adjust his strategy. On the drive back, Thomas took a different route, watching his rearview mirror for any signs of being followed. The roads remained empty except for the occasional farm truck or local vehicle. As he approached his property, Thomas slowed, studying the landscape with a sniper's eye. Everything looked undisturbed, the gate still locked, no fresh tire tracks, the tripwires intact. He pulled up to the gate, unlocked it, and drove through, relocking it behind him. The weight of the Beretta against his side was reassuring as he continued up the long driveway to the house. Inside, Thomas unloaded the chicken feed, then checked each room methodically. Nothing had been disturbed during his absence. He returned to his observation post upstairs, settling in with his binoculars. They would come. That much was certain now. And they would come in force. Thomas checked his watch. Just past noon. He had hours of daylight to strengthen his defenses and prepare for the increased threat. Adapt to changing intelligence, he murmured to himself, already mentally revising his plans. The afternoon sun beat down as Thomas worked to strengthen his defenses. Knowing he faced more than 8 opponents changed everything. He could no longer rely solely on his shooting skills, he needed to control the battlefield. Thomas dug into a storage shed he rarely used, pulling out hunting supplies and old farming equipment. He found a box of hunting caltrips he'd once used to mark deer trails. Now, he scattered them strategically along likely approach routes, hiding them in the tall grass. Next, he filled several plastic jugs with gasoline from his tractor supply. He didn't want to burn his own fields, but a controlled fire could funnel attackers where he wanted them. He positioned the jugs near the edge of his property, camouflaging them with brush. By mid-afternoon, Thomas paused for water, sweat dripping from his brow. His military training had kicked in fully now, each defensive measure linked to the next, creating a carefully orchestrated system. The distant sound of an engine made him freeze. Thomas quickly moved to the shadow of the barn, binoculars ready. A single pickup truck approached on the main road, slowing as it neared his turnoff. The truck passed his entrance without stopping, but Thomas caught sight of the driver, a thin man with a patchy beard, definitely not local. He was surveilling, getting the lay of the land. Scout, Thomas muttered to himself. They're being smart. This confirmed his suspicion that these weren't just random troublemakers. They operated with tactical awareness, sending reconnaissance ahead of the main force. That made them more dangerous. Thomas returned to the house and checked his ammunition supplies. He had plenty for the Barrett and a reasonable amount for the Beretta. Still, against increased numbers, he would need to make every shot count. He settled at his upstairs window, watching the road. The afternoon stretched on with no further activity. As the sun began to set, Thomas ate a cold dinner, never taking his eyes from his observation point. His satellite phone, a relic from his service days that he'd kept for emergencies, sat on the table beside him. Thomas considered calling for help. The nearest military base was 3 hours away. Local police wouldn't stand a chance against organized criminals. He was on his own. Just as darkness began to fall, the perimeter sensor he'd installed at the far edge of his property beeped softly. Thomas quickly checked the small monitor he'd set up. A figure moved through the cornfield, not on the road, but cutting across his land from the west. Thomas grabbed his night vision binoculars. The figure wore dark clothing and moved with purpose, placing small objects at intervals. Even in the growing darkness, Thomas recognized the shape: small wireless cameras. They were setting up surveillance of their own. Thomas remained motionless, watching. If he took action now, he'd reveal that he'd spotted them. Better to know where their cameras were and use that knowledge to his advantage. The figure finished placing the last camera and melted back into the darkness. Thomas marked each camera location on his property map. 4 in total, positioned to watch his house, barn, and main approach road. Amateur placement, Thomas whispered to himself. They'd left blind spots, gaps in their surveillance. That would be their downfall. Night settled fully over the farm. Thomas switched to his thermal scope, scanning the perimeter methodically. No other intruders. For now, they were just watching. Thomas knew what would come next. They'd study his routines, look for weaknesses, plan their approach. Standard tactics. His advantage was experience. Decades of combat operations had taught him to think several moves ahead. He settled in for another night of watchful waiting, mentally rehearsing scenarios. Tomorrow would bring confrontation. He could feel it with the same certainty that had kept him alive through 4 tours of duty. They were coming. But this time, he would be ready. Dawn arrived with a heavy mist clinging to the fields, limiting visibility to less than 50 yards. Thomas watched the fog from his window, a grim smile crossing his weathered face. Poor visibility worked in his favor. It would neutralize their numbers advantage and force them to move cautiously. Thomas had slept in 30-minute intervals throughout the night, always returning to scan the perimeter. Nothing had changed. The enemy cameras remained in place, silently watching his property. He brewed a pot of strong coffee and made a decision. It was time to control the narrative. Moving deliberately into view of one of their cameras, Thomas began his morning chores. He fed the chickens, checked the fences, and inspected his tractor, all while maintaining the appearance of an unsuspecting farmer. To their watching eyes, he would look oblivious to their surveillance. By mid-morning, the mist began to thin. Thomas retreated to the barn, where he'd prepared a special surprise. From various farming chemicals, he'd created several smoke bombs, nothing lethal, but effective for obscuring vision. At noon, Thomas ate lunch on his porch, visibly unarmed, seemingly relaxed. A performance for the cameras. After lunch, he walked to his truck, started it up, and drove slowly down his driveway. He wanted them to think he was leaving. Instead, Thomas parked behind a stand of trees just past his gate, out of sight of their cameras. He slipped into the woods bordering his property, a route he knew wouldn't be visible to their surveillance. Moving silently through the trees, a skill honed through years of combat operations, Thomas approached the first camera location. As expected, no one was watching it physically. They were monitoring remotely. He quickly disabled it, not by destroying it, but by slightly adjusting its angle to point at the sky. One by one, Thomas visited each camera, making similar subtle adjustments. To anyone monitoring, the cameras would still appear operational, but they'd show nothing useful. Task completed, Thomas made his way back to his truck. He'd been gone less than an hour, not long enough to make them suspicious. He drove back up to the house, parking in his usual spot. Inside, he checked his watch. Mid-afternoon now. If they were planning an assault, it would likely come at dusk or after nightfall. Standard procedure for outnumbered attackers. Thomas moved through the house, double-checking his defensive positions. In the kitchen, he filled several pots with water and placed them strategically. Hydration would be important during a prolonged standoff. The satellite phone on the table caught his eye again. He should call someone, let them know what was happening. But who? The sheriff wouldn't arrive in time. Old military contacts might not respond to a civilian matter. After a moment's hesitation, Thomas picked up the phone and dialed a number from memory. Colonel Hayes, answered a gruff voice after 3 rings. "Sir, it's Thomas Rose," he said. "From the 5th Group." A pause. "Rose? Been years. What's the situation?" Thomas had served under Hayes for 2 tours. The colonel had always been direct, no small talk. "Potential hostiles at my location. Drug runners trying to take my farm for operations. Between 12 and 16 armed men expected. Just wanted someone to know." "Need extraction?" Hayes asked immediately. "Negative, sir. I can handle it. Just want it on record somewhere what happened, in case." Thomas trailed off. "Understood," Hayes said. "Want me to call local authorities?" "Not yet. They'd be outgunned. Just keep this conversation in your back pocket." "Will do. Take care of yourself, Rose." The colonel paused, then added, "Good hunting." Thomas ended the call feeling slightly better. Someone knew. Whatever happened next wouldn't go unnoticed. Outside, the sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon. Thomas checked his weapons one last time and settled into his primary defensive position. The waiting was almost over. He could feel it. Dusk settled over the farm, painting the sky in deep purples and oranges. Thomas watched from his upstairs window as shadows lengthened across the fields. His instincts told him they would come tonight. The first sign came just after full darkness. His motion sensor at the southern boundary beeped softly. Thomas checked the display, multiple heat signatures moving slowly through the cornfield. They were approaching on foot, avoiding the road entirely. "Smart," Thomas muttered. They'd learned from their reconnaissance. He switched to his night vision binoculars. 4 men moved in a tactical formation, keeping low among the corn stalks. Each carried what looked like an assault rifle. Not the bikers he'd met before, these moved with military precision. Professionals. Thomas remained perfectly still, controlling his breathing. They hadn't reached his first line of defenses yet. Moments later, a second alert, this time from the eastern perimeter. 3 more figures approaching through the woods. They were splitting their forces, coming from multiple directions. A classic pincer movement. Thomas nodded to himself. Whoever was in charge knew basic tactics. The sound of engines in the distance caught his attention. Motorcycles, at least 5 or 6 from the sound, approached on the main road. A diversion, meant to draw his attention while the foot teams moved into position. Thomas didn't take the bait. He remained focused on the men moving through his property. The first group had reached the edge of the cornfield now, where he'd placed his first line of defense, the fishing line tripwires with attached noisemakers. One of the men tripped the wire. Cans clattered in the darkness. The group immediately dropped to prone positions, freezing in place. Thomas smiled grimly. They were disciplined. This wouldn't be easy. After a tense minute, the group began moving again, more cautiously now. They were about 200 yards from the house. The eastern group had reached the tree line. One man stepped on a caltrip, stifling a curse that carried faintly through the night air. The motorcycles grew louder, then suddenly cut their engines about half a mile down the road. Thomas checked the time. They were coordinating their approach. It was time. Thomas moved to the prepared position near the rear window. He pressed a button on a remote device he'd rigged from an old garage door opener. Near the southern cornfield, a bright spotlight suddenly illuminated, powered by a car battery. The effect was immediate. The approaching men were caught in the harsh light, momentarily blinded and exposed. Thomas didn't fire. Not yet. This was just the first move in his defense. The spotlight had another purpose: it drew fire. 3 of the exposed men opened up, riddling the light with bullets until it shattered into darkness. Thomas nodded to himself. Now he knew their positions exactly, and they'd wasted ammunition on a decoy. The eastern group, hearing the gunfire, accelerated their approach. Thomas triggered his second trap, one of the gasoline jugs he'd placed, ignited by a simple remote detonator. It burst into flames, creating a barrier of fire between the eastern group and the house. The sudden illumination revealed their positions perfectly. Thomas counted 4 men, not 3 as he'd initially thought. All armed with automatic weapons. In the confusion, the motorcycle group had begun their approach up the main road. Through his thermal scope, Thomas could see them clearly, 8 riders moving in a tight formation. Thomas took a deep breath, steadying himself. 16 attackers in total, approaching from 3 directions. Just as he'd anticipated. He moved to his primary firing position, the Barrett M82 already in place. Through the scope, he observed the lead motorcycle rider. Range, 600 yards. Wind, negligible. Humidity, moderate. Thomas exhaled slowly, his finger caressing the trigger. The game had begun. Thomas's first shot cracked through the night, the sound echoing across the fields. The lead motorcycle's front tire exploded, sending the rider tumbling onto the dirt road. The other riders immediately scattered, seeking cover in the ditches alongside the road. Without wasting a moment, Thomas shifted his aim to the southern group. Through his scope, he could see them advancing in short bursts, using tactical movement. He fired twice more, not at the men, but at the ground near them, kicking up dirt and forcing them back into the cornfield. His message was clear: I can hit you if I choose to. The eastern group had split to circle around the fire. Thomas triggered another trap, a second gasoline jug that burst into flames, cutting off their approach completely. "Command, this is Team 2, a voice crackled from somewhere in the darkness. "We're pinned down. He's got superior position." They were using radios. Thomas listened carefully as he reloaded the Barrett. "Hold position," came the response. "Team 3, circle to the north. The cameras are dark, he must have found them." Thomas smiled grimly. They were adapting, but so was he. He'd anticipated a northern approach and prepared for it. He moved quickly to the north-facing window where he'd positioned his second defensive setup. Through the thermal scope of his Beretta, fitted with a custom mount, he watched as 3 figures emerged from the tree line to the north. The bikers had made a critical error, splitting their forces too thin. Now, instead of 16 men attacking as a unit, they were scattered in groups of 3 and 4 across his property. Thomas keyed his own radio, an old military unit he'd reprogrammed to their frequency. "You're on private property," he broadcast calmly. "I've notified authorities. Leave now, and this ends." There was a long silence before a familiar voice responded, "Ray, the biker leader. You're bluffing, old man. No authorities coming. You're alone." "Check your cameras," Thomas replied. "Check your team too. I haven't killed anyone yet. That's your only warning." Another silence followed. Thomas used it to move to a different firing position, following the rule he'd lived by for decades: fire and relocate. "We just want the land," Ray finally answered. "You can walk away. Nobody needs to die." Thomas didn't respond. Instead, he triggered his final defensive measure, the smoke bombs he'd placed around the perimeter. Thick white smoke began billowing across the property, obscuring everything from normal vision. Through his thermal scope, Thomas watched as confusion spread among the attackers. Their coordinated approach fell apart as visibility dropped to zero. "I can see you," Thomas broadcast one last time. "You can't see me. Those are bad odds." The effect was immediate. The northern team began retreating, then the eastern team. The motorcycle group, already disrupted by the first shot, started their engines and began backing away down the road. "This isn't over." Ray's voice was tinged with rage on the radio. "It is for tonight," Thomas replied calmly. Within minutes, the thermal signatures were moving away from his property in all directions. Thomas maintained his vigil for hours, watching for any sign of their return, but the night remained quiet. As dawn broke, Thomas finally allowed himself to relax slightly. He'd won the first round without taking a life. But he harbored no illusions. They would return, perhaps with more men, perhaps with a different strategy. He made a call on his satellite phone. "Colonel Hayes." "Sir, it's Rose again. Situation contained for now. But I'd appreciate that call to the authorities after all. This isn't over." "Already done, son," Hayes replied. "Local sheriff and FBI field office. They'll be there by noon." Thomas looked out over his farm as the morning sun painted the fields golden. The land he'd sought for peace had become a battlefield, but he'd defended it. And in doing so, he'd remembered something important: sometimes peace must be protected with strength. "Thank you, sir," Thomas said quietly. "No, Thomas," the colonel replied. "Thank you for reminding them that some old farmers shouldn't be underestimated."